The gentle hum of engines filled the air as passengers moved through the luxurious terminal of Royal Airlines' first-class lounge. Businessmen in tailored suits checked their watches impatiently. A few celebrities tried to remain unnoticed behind designer sunglasses, and a handful of socialites clinked their glasses filled with top-tier champagne. The atmosphere was thick with wealth and exclusivity. Only a select few ever experienced this level of luxury. Among them, a figure stood out, not because of any eccentricity, but because his presence seemed to challenge an unspoken rule. Solomon Jacobs, an effortlessly poised black billionaire, stepped into the terminal, clad in a custom-tailored navy blue suit with an air of quiet authority. His wristwatch, a subtle Patek Philippe Grand Complications, shimmered under the soft airport lights. But it wasn't his attire or accessories that made heads turn. It was who he was. Solomon wasn't just another rich man. He was a self-made billionaire, the founder and CEO of Jacobs Innovations, a tech empire that dominated the global AI and cybersecurity industry. His name carried weight, enough to make stock markets fluctuate with a single tweet. He had graced the cover of Forbes multiple times. His company was valued in the hundreds of billions, and yet he still wasn't exempt from the subtle prejudices woven into high society. As he walked toward Gate 17, whispers trailed behind him. "That's Solomon Jacobs, right?" a businessman murmured to his colleague, eyes flicking toward him. "Yeah, but I don't know why he bothers flying commercial," the other scoffed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Solomon had heard it all before. The questioning glances, the doubtful expressions that lingered a moment too long, the unspoken thought behind them. Does he really belong here? He sighed inwardly but didn't let it show. He was used to this game. He had been playing it since his early days as a struggling entrepreneur, when venture capitalists saw his genius but hesitated to invest, until he forced them to acknowledge him through sheer excellence. Today, he wasn't here for a fight. He was here to fly to New York for an urgent global tech summit, a gathering of the world's most powerful corporate leaders. Missing this flight was not an option. "Mr. Jacobs, welcome aboard," said the captain himself, Henry Lancaster, as Solomon approached the boarding line for first-class passengers. Lancaster, a seasoned pilot in his late 50s, extended a firm handshake. Unlike many others, his respect was genuine. "Captain Lancaster?" Solomon greeted, shaking his hand. "Pleasure to be flying with you." "We're honored to have you on board, sir. Safe travels," Lancaster said, tipping his cap before returning to the cockpit. Solomon moved toward the jet bridge, adjusting the cufflinks on his silk shirt, when a sharp, assessing gaze landed on him. Enter Karen Whitmore, the embodiment of condescension. At the entrance of the plane stood Karen Whitmore, the senior flight attendant assigned to first class. She was tall, blonde, and carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who believed she was more important than she actually was. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, and her lipstick, a precise shade of corporate red, was applied with military precision. At first, her smile was automatic, the rehearsed soulless kind meant to placate wealthy passengers. But when her eyes flicked to Solomon's dark skin, something changed. The corners of her mouth tightened. Her gaze, which had been warm and welcoming for the wealthy white businessman before him, turned coldly professional. She tilted her head, scanning him as if searching for a mistake. "Sir, I believe first class is reserved for our premium passengers," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness. Solomon, who had encountered this exact type of attitude countless times before, didn't even blink. "And you believe I'm not one of them?" he asked, his voice even but sharp as a scalpel. Karen hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but then quickly recovered. "Oh, I just meant—" "My name is Solomon Jacobs," he interrupted, lowering his voice just enough for the warning to register. "I believe you'll find my name on your manifest. If you check your list, you'll see I'm seated in one." The air inside the first-class cabin of Royal Airlines Flight 117 carried an unshakable tension, one that only Solomon Jacobs seemed to sense. From the moment he took his seat, there was something off, not just about Karen Whitmore, but about the entire atmosphere of the flight. The sleek leather seats, The subtle scent of jasmine-infused air and the sound of ice clinking in crystal glasses were meant to create an environment of luxury and ease. And yet, an unease settled over him like an invisible fog. Perhaps it was Karen's barely concealed disdain. Perhaps it was the way some passengers seemed to exchange glances when he walked past, as if his presence in first class was a disruption of an unspoken order. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Solomon had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming. The cold shoulder. For the first hour of the flight, Karen kept her distance, not out of respect, but out of silent defiance. She fawned over the older white businessmen in the row behind Solomon, refilling their drinks, laughing at their tired jokes. She lingered at their seats, asking if they needed extra pillows, additional snacks, or a more comfortable temperature setting. But when she passed Solomon, nothing, not a glance, not a question, not a shred of acknowledgement. Solomon wasn't bothered by the lack of service. He had dealt with far worse in the past. But he was bothered by what it represented. Karen was sending a message that he didn't belong here, that, despite his wealth, his power, and his status, he was still beneath the unspoken hierarchy of the privileged. Solomon had seen this before in boardrooms, in private clubs, at elite events. People like Karen, people who built their entire self-worth around their imagined superiority, couldn't stand seeing a black man who not only sat among them, but sat above them. The first incident, a spilled drink or a message. It happened suddenly, a clink of glass, a sharp gasp from the woman across the aisle, and then cold liquid soaking through Solomon's tailored suit. Karen stood over him, holding an empty champagne flute, her eyes wide with mock horror. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, her hand flying to her chest in an exaggerated display of false shock. I'm so sorry. I don't know how that happened." The cold liquid seeped into the fabric of Solomon's $15,000 Tom Ford suit, but he remained perfectly still. Other passengers turned, curious but not quite concerned. After all, what was a spilled drink to them? An accident, nothing more. But Solomon knew better. This wasn't an accident. This was a test. Would he react? Would he lose his composure? Would he play into the stereotype Karen likely believed in? The angry black man who couldn't handle being disrespected. Solomon exhaled slowly, dabbing the stain with a linen napkin as Karen waited. Waited for him to snap, to demand an apology, to make a scene. But he didn't. Instead, he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that wasn't friendly at all. "Apology accepted," he said smoothly, locking eyes with her. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to dry off." Karen's expression flickered just for a moment, a crack in her carefully controlled facade. She had been expecting anger. She had been hoping for outrage. But she hadn't been prepared for this. The Whispers of Flight. 117. Solomon rose from his seat, heading toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin. As he moved, he noticed something odd. Passengers watching him out of the corner of their eyes, their expressions unreadable. And then, just as he reached the restroom door, he heard it. A whisper. So faint, so barely there that it could have been a trick of the air currents. "Get out, while you still can." Solomon froze mid-step, his hand hovering over the lavatory handle. His gaze snapped up to the mirror-like reflection on the polished metal wall beside him. For a split second, just a fleeting moment, he could have sworn he saw something behind him. A figure. Not Karen. Not any of the passengers. Something else. Something watching him. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Solomon swallowed hard, shaking off the sudden, inexplicable chill that wrapped around him like unseen hands. "I'm imagining things," he told himself. He pushed open the restroom door, stepped inside, and locked it behind him. Karen's growing frustration. Back in first class, Karen's smile had finally slipped. She stood near the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The billionaire bastard had brushed off her humiliation like it was nothing, And that infuriated her. Karen had spent years perfecting her delicate balance of social cruelty, a well-crafted dance of condescension designed to remind people like him of their place. And yet, Solomon Jacobs hadn't reacted the way he was supposed to. He was supposed to lash out. He was supposed to demand to speak to the captain, but instead, he had smiled at her, as if he knew something she didn't. And that was unacceptable. Karen's jaw tightened as she watched the restroom door, waiting for Solomon to return. She wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. The second incident. Just a simple mistake. Solomon emerged from the lavatory, his suit still damp but no longer dripping. He moved back toward his seat, but as he did, he noticed something strange. His tray table was down, and on it sat a meal. An untouched meal, plated perfectly, except for one thing. It was a children's meal. A smiley-face pancake, a cup of apple juice with a straw, and a small pack of crayons sat neatly on the tray. A slow, calculated humiliation. Karen, standing just beside the galley, watched him with open amusement, arms crossed, waiting for his reaction. Solomon stopped, looked at the tray, then looked at her. The cabin was silent, the tension thick as smoke before a fire. "Cute," Solomon murmured, his voice deceptively calm. "I assume this is some kind of joke?" Karen, the turbulence rocked the plane violently, causing the overhead compartments to rattle. Gasps and nervous murmurs filled the first-class cabin as passengers clutched their armrests. Some white-knuckled their champagne glasses, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Solomon Jacobs remained eerily still. He wasn't a man easily rattled. Years of building an empire, of navigating cutthroat business deals, of facing down powerful men who underestimated him, had sharpened his instincts to razor-like precision. He understood when a challenge was merely a game of control. But this was different. This wasn't a corporate power play. This wasn't Karen's pathetic attempt at racial humiliation. This was something else entirely. The whisper from before still echoed in his ears. "Turn back, before it's too late." It had been right there, chillingly close, spoken in a voice that did not belong to anyone on this plane. As the turbulence settled, Karen forced a laugh, shaking her head as she smoothed the front of her pristine uniform. "My goodness, that was a rough one," she chirped, regaining her composure with practiced ease. She cast Solomon a lingering, smug glance, as if daring him to say something about the children's meal stunt she had just pulled. Solomon did not rise to the bait. Instead, he turned his gaze to the passengers around him. Some looked as disturbed as he felt, particularly a woman seated near the aisle, her eyes darting about, hands trembling as she clutched a rosary. But others, including the group of well-dressed businessmen Karen had been entertaining, seemed oddly composed. No, not just composed. Unnaturally calm. One of them, a silver-haired man in his 60s, adjusted his cufflinks, then leaned toward Karen with a knowing smirk. "Seems like the plane wants to shake things up tonight," he mused, his voice too casual for what had just happened. Karen giggled softly, her lips curling in amusement. "It does have a mind of its own, doesn't it?" Solomon narrowed his eyes. There was something wrong here. He could feel it. The elderly woman, a warning too late. As Solomon reached for a napkin to wipe off the remnants of the spilled drink on his suit, a frail hand suddenly touched his wrist. He turned to find the elderly woman across the aisle staring at him, her eyes wide with silent urgency. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Solomon raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" The woman's fingers tightened around his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "This plane." Her voice trembled. "There's something about this flight. I was here before." Solomon stilled. The seat that should be empty. Solomon's mind raced. He needed to find out more. As discreetly as possible, he pulled out his phone, but the screen refused to turn on. Not a black screen. Not low battery, just nothing. That wasn't normal. Solomon turned his attention to the seating arrangement. His gaze flickered toward the far end of first class, where a single vacant seat stood out. Something about it felt off. It was pristine, untouched, as if no one had ever sat there, but then the overhead light above the seat flickered, and for the briefest moment, a shadow moved in the seat. Solomon's pulse spiked. There had been someone there, a passenger who wasn't on the manifest, and now? Now they were gone. The air turned heavy. A chill seeped into Solomon's bones as he turned back toward Karen. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since this flight began, he saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Fear. Not of him, not of being exposed for her racism. Number Karen Whitmore, the woman who had been mocking him, humiliating him, belittling him since the moment he stepped onto this plane, was afraid. Solomon stood up. Karen immediately stiffened, her practiced smile faltering for just a split second. "Is there something I can assist you with, Mr. Jacobs?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Solomon glanced at the empty seat again, then back at her. "Tell me," he said, his voice low but commanding. "How long have you worked for this airline?" Karen blinked at the sudden change in topic, but she recovered quickly. 10 years. Solomon nodded. "Then tell me something else." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him. "Why are we flying on a plane that shouldn't exist?" Karen's smile vanished. She paled, and for the first time all night she had no answer. The captain's intervention. Before Karen could speak, a voice crackled through the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. We seem to be experiencing some minor turbulence." There was something off about his voice. Something strained. "Ladies and gentlemen," he continued, "if you could remain in your seats, we should be arriving at our destination." Static. Loud. Abrupt. Then the speakers let out a sound that wasn't static at all. It was a whisper, not just one. Dozens, hundreds. All overlapping, all speaking in a language that didn't belong to this world. Then, silence. Dead. Cold. Silence. The eyes in the window. Solomon turned to the window, his breath coming faster now. He didn't want to look, but something forced him to. And when he did, there was a face in the reflection. Not his. Not Karen's. Someone else. Something else. Its mouth stretched open in a silent scream. And then the plane dropped. A violent, sickening plummet that sent trays, glasses, and even luggage flying. Passengers screamed. Karen stumbled backward, her hands gripping onto a seat to keep herself from falling. Solomon clenched his jaw, holding onto the armrest as his stomach lurched. Then, just as suddenly as it had dropped, the plane stabilized. Silence. Karen was panting, her eyes wild with terror. Solomon turned to her once more. "Tell me what's happening," he ordered. And this time, Karen did not argue, because now she was just as terrified as he was. The plane's sudden plummet had turned the first-class cabin into a scene of chaos. Passengers who had been sipping on premium champagne now gripped their armrests in panic. Trays had spilled, glassware shattered, and overhead compartments groaned as the aircraft violently steadied itself. For a moment there was only silence, a fragile, suffocating silence where no one dared to speak, as if the air itself had become too thick with something unseen. But Solomon wasn't silent. His sharp eyes flicked toward Karen Whitmore, who was still gripping the back of a seat, her breath coming in uneven gasps. She looked horrified, and not because of the turbulence. She knew something, and this time she couldn't hide it anymore. The crack in Karen's facade. Solomon straightened his suit, brushing off the last remnants of spilled champagne and unease. The silence in the cabin stretched as Karen struggled to regain her composure. But it was too late. The flight attendant who had spent the entire trip mocking him, belittling him, trying to make him feel unwelcome, was now pale, shaken, and visibly afraid. He took one step forward, his towering presence casting a shadow over her. "Karen," he said, his voice a low command. "Tell me. Now." Karen flinched. I don't lie." His tone was like steel, slicing through the panic in the air. "Not anymore." Karen looked away, her lips pressed together tightly. For the first time, her usual superiority had crumbled, leaving something that almost resembled regret. Finally, she exhaled, trembling. "There was another Flight 117, she whispered. "Years ago, and it never landed." A chill ran down Solomon's spine. He knew it. The elderly woman was right. This plane, this flight, shouldn't exist. The vanished flight. Karen swallowed hard, her hands twisting in the hem of her uniform. "It was supposed to be a routine trip. Los Angeles to New York," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But somewhere over the Midwest, Flight 117 just vanished. No distress signals, no black box recovered. Nothing." Solomon narrowed his eyes. "How do you know this?" Karen hesitated. Then her fingers gripped her wrist, as if something invisible had wrapped around it tightly. "Because my uncle was the pilot." Solomon's stomach clenched. Karen's mocking arrogance, her constant need to prove her authority, her obsession with control, it all made sense now. She wasn't just an entitled flight attendant. She was connected to whatever was happening on this plane. Solomon's voice lowered. "And yet you still boarded this flight?" Karen let out a shaky laugh, one filled with fear and bitterness. "I didn't have a choice," she muttered. "No one ever does." Solomon's eyes darkened. "What the hell does that mean?" Before Karen could answer, the intercom crackled, and then a voice. A hollow, static-filled voice that did not belong to the captain. "You were never supposed to be here." Every hair on Solomon's arm stood on end as the voice seeped through the speakers. Deep, hollow, wrong. "You were never supposed to be here." It was as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, their tones merging into something inhuman. Passengers stiffened. The elderly woman across the aisle crossed herself, whispering a frantic prayer. Solomon's breath slowed. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was something alive. Karen's face turned ashen, her hands gripping the seat beside her until her knuckles turned white. "No," she murmured. "It's not supposed to be happening yet." Solomon's pulse spiked. "Yet?" Karen's eyes snapped to his, filled with something that looked dangerously close to desperation. "They always come at the halfway point," she whispered. "That's when the plane—" A loud bang shook the cabin. And then the lights flickered. The shadows in the aisle. First-class passengers screamed as the overhead lights strobed violently, flashing between brightness and total darkness. The temperature in the cabin plummeted, turning the air sharp and frigid, and then Solomon saw them. Figures. Tall, thin, grotesquely distorted figures standing in the aisles, their bodies twisting and flickering like bad television reception. Their faces were featureless, but their presence was suffocating. Solomon's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He wasn't the only one who saw them. The elderly woman let out a broken sob. A businessman in a $10,000 suit clamped his hands over his mouth, his eyes wide with silent terror. And Karen? Karen stood frozen, staring at the figures like she had seen them before. The impossible pilot. Suddenly, a new figure emerged from the cockpit. Not Captain Lancaster, not the co-pilot, someone else. Solomon's stomach turned ice cold. The man wore an old-fashioned pilot's uniform, his buttons gleaming under the flickering cabin lights. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by something unnatural. His eyes weren't eyes at all, just empty sockets, as if someone had stolen them away long ago. Karen let out a strangled gasp. Uncle! The figure in the pilot's uniform tilted its head unnaturally, as if recognizing Karen. Then it smiled. A slow, jagged grin that should not have been possible. And in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming from the bottom of the ocean, it spoke. Karen, I told you, you can never leave. Karen let out a broken cry, stumbling backward. Solomon grabbed her arm, forcing her to look at him. What the hell is happening? He demanded. Karen's lips trembled. Then her voice cracked. She whispered. I think we're already dead. The descent into madness. The plane lurched violently, sending passengers flying against their seats. The overhead compartments burst open and luggage tumbled down like dead weight. The air grew thick, almost solid, making it hard to breathe. And then, from the cockpit, the ghostly pilot stepped forward, his voice dropping into something horrifically familiar. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. A mockery of Captain Lancaster's voice. Welcome aboard the final flight of your lives. The whispers returned, louder now. Swarming, consuming. Passengers screamed. Solomon's mind raced. This plane, this cursed, impossible plane, wasn't heading to New York. It was heading somewhere far, far worse. And unless he found a way to break whatever night, the air inside Flight 117 had turned thick and heavy, pressing down on Solomon Jacobs like a weight he couldn't shake off. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, but even his legendary composure was fraying at the edges. Passengers in first class were no longer whispering. They were staring. Some of them wide-eyed with terror, others unnaturally calm, as if they knew something he didn't. And at the front of the cabin, standing just beyond the cockpit door, was the thing wearing a pilot's uniform. Not Captain Lancaster. Not anyone human. Something else. Its voice still echoed through the intercom, an unholy distortion of what a captain's announcement should have sounded like. Welcome aboard the final flight of your lives. The air grew colder. The plane shuddered again. Not turbulence this time, but something deeper, more unnatural. And then Solomon saw it, through the small window near his seat. Nothing. No city lights, no clouds, no stars. Just blackness. An endless abyss stretching out beyond the plane, as if they were no longer in the sky at all. The trapped souls of Flight 117. Solomon turned to Karen, gripping her wrist tight enough to make her wince. You said your uncle was the pilot of the first Flight 117, he said, his voice low and sharp. Tell me everything, right now. Karen hesitated, her usually cruel, arrogant demeanor replaced with something raw and broken. She glanced back at the thing wearing her uncle's uniform. She swallowed. I don't know everything, but I know that the original Flight 117 never made it to New York. Solomon stiffened. What do you mean? Karen's eyes flickered with shame and fear. I mean it just kept flying. Solomon's blood turned to ice. Karen clenched her jaw as if fighting back something deep and personal. My uncle was on that flight. They said he disappeared with it. But sometimes my family, we heard things. She inhaled shakily. Calls from his number, but when we answered, it wasn't him. Solomon felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Then who was it? Karen closed her eyes. The plane. The man in seat 7. Before Solomon could press further, a ragged breath cut through the eerie quiet of first class. A passenger 2 rows ahead of him, a balding man in a gray suit, had begun muttering to himself. No, not muttering. Praying. His hands clutched at his armrests, his lips moving frantically. Solomon caught just a few words. Forgive me. I shouldn't have... We were never supposed to... And then, abruptly, he turned, staring directly at Solomon. His eyes were wide and filled with horror. "You need to get off this plane," the man whispered, "before it takes you too." Solomon's chest tightened. Before he could respond, the overhead lights dimmed completely, leaving only the cold glow of emergency aisle markers. A deep groan reverberated through the cabin. And then, from the cockpit, the ghostly pilot stepped forward. It took one slow, deliberate step into the first-class aisle, its polished black shoes eerily silent on the carpeted floor. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, empty eye sockets locking onto Solomon, and then it smiled. The captain speaks. The thing wearing a pilot's uniform opened its mouth. A long, rattling breath escaped, as if its lungs were filled with dust and decay. And then, in a voice that was both dead and alive, it spoke. "Solomon Jacobs." The entire plane seemed to exhale in unison, the cabin groaning like a living thing. Solomon's blood ran cold. He had never told the flight crew his name. "We've been waiting for you." Solomon's hands clenched into tight fists. "What the hell do you want from me?" The pilot's smile widened, a grotesque mockery of something human. "We want you to take your seat." Solomon felt a shiver crawl down his spine. "What seat?" The pilot turned its head slowly, its skeletal fingers pointing toward the empty seat near the back of first class, the one that had been unoccupied the entire flight. The seat that had flickered with shadows. Seat 7. A. The balding man in the gray suit let out a strangled noise, shaking his head wildly. "No," he gasped. "Not again! Not again!" The air turned thick with static, and then the passenger in 7A suddenly appeared, a man who had not been there before. Solomon's breath caught in his throat. The man was him, an exact copy of himself, sitting there with his hands folded neatly in his lap. And then it turned its head and smiled. The other Solomon. Karen let out a choked sob. "Oh my God," she whispered. The other Solomon stared directly at him, its eyes devoid of anything human. Solomon took a step back, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "Why are you showing me this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The pilot let out a low chuckle. "Because, Mr. Jacobs, this has already happened." Solomon's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. "No." His voice hardened. "I refuse to believe that." The pilot's grin widened, its empty sockets seeming to pull him in. "You already took your seat, Solomon. You just don't remember it yet." The lights flickered violently, plunging the cabin into darkness. And in that split second, the other Solomon moved. 1 second, it was seated in 7A. The next, it was standing right in front of him. Solomon barely had time to react before cold fingers wrapped around his throat. And then, everything went black. Darkness. It swallowed everything. Solomon Jacobs was no longer on the plane. He was nowhere. And yet, he could feel cold fingers tightening around his throat, a grip not meant to choke him, but to hold him in place. He struggled, twisting against his own reflection, the duplicate Solomon that had appeared in seat 7 a moment before. But this thing wasn't just a copy. It was something else entirely, a being that shouldn't exist. "You don't belong here," it whispered, its voice an exact replica of his own. Except hollow. Empty. Solomon's mind whirled violently. Was he dead? Was this some twisted hallucination? Or was he really trapped in a fate worse than either? His fingers clawed at the arms holding him, his body fighting against something unseen. And then, a blinding, burning flash of light erupted around him. And just like that, he was back. Return to the living! Solomon gasped as the world slammed back into place. He was in first class again. His body lurched forward, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his temple. His hands shot to his throat, feeling for something, anything. But there were no marks, no bruises, no evidence that anything had happened. Had it been real, or? Karen's voice pierced through the fog of his thoughts. Solomon! He turned, eyes wild. Karen was kneeling beside him, her usual cocky arrogance completely gone. Her hands trembled violently, her pupils dilated with pure terror. What the hell just happened? She whispered. Solomon's hands clenched into fists. He turned toward seat 7A. It was empty again. No reflection of himself. No shadowy doppelganger. Just an untouched seat on a doomed flight. And yet, the air around it flickered, like a mirage trapped inside the plane. The forgotten passengers. Solomon slowly stood, ignoring the stiffness in his limbs, and scanned the cabin. Passengers were still frozen in various states of shock. Some clutched rosaries, others whispered prayers. But something else was wrong. Karen saw it too. Her breath hitched. There are less of them. Solomon snapped his gaze back to her. She was right. The first-class cabin wasn't full anymore. At least 5 passengers were missing. Not in the bathroom, not slumped over. Just gone. Their seats were still warm. Their belongings still there. But they, the people themselves, had vanished. Karen shook violently, rubbing her hands over her arms as if she could shake the nightmare off. This can't be real, she muttered. This can't be. And then the cockpit door creaked open. The pilot who never left. The moment the door swung wide, Solomon knew the real captain wasn't coming out, because it wasn't him anymore. A tall figure stepped through, its presence wrong, distorted, like something that had been stretched across time itself. It still wore a pilot's uniform, but the face, it was a mixture of flesh and bone, shifting between life and decay. One second, it had the smiling confidence of a seasoned airline captain. The next, it was a skull, grinning with hollow black sockets. Karen gasped in horror. "Uncle," she breathed. The figure's head snapped toward her. A sick, wet crack echoed through the air as if the bones in its neck were barely holding together. "Karen!" it rasped. Its voice was ancient. Wrong. Heavy with something that didn't belong in this world. Karen stumbled backwards so fast she nearly fell into Solomon. No, you're dead," she choked out. "You disappeared. You... The captain thing took a slow step forward. "I never left." The overhead lights shuddered violently, casting shadows that didn't match their movements. Solomon's mind raced. This wasn't just about him. Karen was part of this too. A choice with no winners. The creature wearing Captain Whitmore's uniform stopped just short of them. Its decayed, the plane was falling. Not toward any airport. Not toward land. Not toward anything recognizable. Outside the windows, the world was gone, replaced by a void so deep, so endless it felt like staring into the mouth of something ancient. Something waiting. The engines roared in defiance, but it was futile. The aircraft wasn't in control anymore. Neither was the pilot. And neither was Solomon Jacobs. The last passengers. First class, once bustling with privileged elites, was now a graveyard of empty seats. Only a handful of passengers remained, their faces frozen in eerie calm, as if they already knew how this would end. A businessman sat perfectly upright, his eyes wide and unblinking. The elderly woman who had whispered prayers earlier was silent now, her hands resting on her lap as though she had accepted her fate. And at the front of the cabin, the captain thing still stood. Watching, waiting. Solomon's heartbeat thundered, his mind racing through every scenario, every way out. There had to be a way out. Had to be. The cockpit call. Suddenly, the intercom crackled. A voice pierced through the static. A voice Solomon recognized. "This is Captain Reed Lancaster. If anyone can hear this, respond." Now, the real captain. Solomon's head snapped toward the cockpit door. Karen had told him the original Flight 117 had vanished midair. Had it been this same void? This same nightmare? And if so, was Captain Lancaster trapped inside it too? Solomon didn't waste another second. Ignoring the weight pressing against his limbs, he lunged toward the cockpit. The moment his hand touched the door, the plane split apart. The void opens. A horrific sound tore through the cabin. Not metal ripping, not turbulence, but something older, something alive. The walls of the aircraft shuddered, warping like a reflection in a rippling pool of black water. The rows of first-class seats twisted, stretching impossibly long before snapping back into place. And then, the windows exploded. But instead of the howling winds of the upper atmosphere, there was only silence. Black tendrils of something unnatural slithered into the cabin, curling like fingers reaching for their prey. Passengers didn't scream. They didn't move. They just vanished, one by one, as if they had never been there at all. Solomon threw himself forward. He had one chance to reach the cockpit. He grabbed the handle and yanked. The captain, who never left the cockpit, was wrong. It was both a room and not a room, a place out of sync with reality. The control panels flickered between decades, some buttons belonging to a modern Boeing aircraft, others to an ancient warplane. And seated in the captain's chair was Reed Lancaster? Except he wasn't alone. Something sat beside him. Not the co-pilot, not a person, not even a ghost. Something incomplete. A shape without form. A presence without a body. And yet, it was staring right at Solomon. "You're not supposed to be here, Mr. Jacobs." Solomon's breath caught in his throat. Captain Lancaster was alive, but his eyes told a different story. They were empty, tired, haunted, like a man who had been flying forever. Solomon took a tentative step forward. "Captain," he said, his voice hoarse, "we have to land this plane. Now." Lancaster let out a slow, bitter laugh. "You still don't get it, do you?" Solomon froze. The captain's hand tightened on the controls, his knuckles white. "There is no landing. The eternal flight." Lancaster turned, finally looking Solomon in the eye. "This flight never had a destination." Solomon's stomach dropped. "No," he growled. "That's not possible." The captain's expression darkened. "What do you think happened to the first Flight 117? The words hit Solomon like a hammer. "You mean—" Captain Lancaster exhaled, running a shaking hand through his graying hair. "I was the captain of the original Flight 117. Solomon's lungs stopped working. No, that wasn't possible. The plane was falling into nothing. The cockpit controls flashed erratically, alarms blaring and warning, but there was nowhere to crash. No ground, no sky, just an endless abyss waiting to consume them. And yet, Solomon Jacobs didn't let go of the throttle. If this flight was cursed to continue forever, then he would end it himself, even if it meant going down with it. The captain's last moments. Captain Reed Lancaster fought against him, trying to wrestle the controls back. "You don't understand," the older man barked, his voice raw. "You can't crash it. It doesn't work that way." Solomon's muscles burned as he forced the yoke forward, deeper, faster. "If there's no landing," he gritted out, "then I'll make one." The plane groaned violently, the fuselage trembling like it was tearing apart at the seams. The darkness outside began to ripple, as if reacting to Solomon's defiance. And then, the co-pilot seat moved. Or rather, the thing in it did. It shifted, its shapeless mass flickering, tendrils of shadow curling outward like smoke trapped inside a bottle. A voice, not spoken but felt, rattled inside Solomon's skull. "You do not decide when the flight ends." Solomon's vision blurred, a flood of images assaulting his mind, a memory that wasn't his. The first flight, 117. The original Flight 117. A captain just like him, gripping the controls. A cockpit just like this one, alarms blaring, warning of a descent into nowhere. And a choice. One seat must be filled. The captain had chosen himself, had taken the seat, and the flight had continued, again and again, trapped in a loop of doomed souls never to reach their destination. Solomon snapped back to the present. His grip on the yoke tightened. No, he growled. Not this time. He would not become the next sacrifice. The shadow of Karen. A sharp, eerie laugh echoed behind him. Solomon turned, and his blood froze. Karen was back, or rather something wearing her face. She stood just outside the cockpit, her eyes pitch black, her lips curled into a smirk. "You always thought you were better than me," she sneered, her voice distorted. Solomon's chest tightened. "You're not Karen," he said coldly. The thing that looked like her tilted its head. "Maybe not," it whispered. "But I remember everything she felt before she got swallowed up." It took a step forward, and suddenly Solomon couldn't move. A force held him in place, gripping his limbs like unseen chains. "You want to break the cycle?" The thing purred, leaning close. Her voice dropped into something deeper, inhuman. "Then take the seat." Solomon's heartbeat thundered. He fought, straining against the invisible weight crushing him down. But Karen, or the thing wearing her, wasn't finished. She leaned in, her lips almost at his ear. "Or I'll take someone else." And then the cockpit door blew open. The last passenger. Solomon saw her too late. The elderly woman from first class. The one who had been praying earlier. She stood just beyond the cockpit, her face blank, her hands trembling. Karen's shadowy form turned toward her. "You'll do just fine." Solomon's blood ran cold. "No!" he roared. He forced his body to move, shoving himself forward. But the darkness moved faster. It lunged toward the woman, enveloping her like smoke swallowing light. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. And then she was gone. Vanished. Like she had never been there at all. The moment she disappeared, the plane lurched, the engine stuttered, the darkness outside the windows shifted, and Solomon felt it. The plane was stabilizing. The loop had been reset. Another soul had taken his place. The final landing. A cold, hollow silence filled the cockpit. Solomon staggered back, his breathing ragged, unsteady. Karen's shadowy form was gone. The thing in the co-pilot's seat had vanished. And Lancaster? Lancaster was watching him. The old captain's face was tight with something unreadable. "You understand now," he murmured. Solomon's jaw locked. Yes, he understood. The cycle wasn't broken. Not really. Someone else had taken the seat, but the plane still flew, still continued. But now they had a destination. Outside the window, through the thinning veil of darkness, city lights began to emerge. A runway, a control tower, a real airport. Solomon's breath caught. They were landing. For the first time in decades, Flight 117 was landing. The aftermath. The moment the wheels touched the ground, reality snapped back into place. The cockpit's controls flickered, the instrument stabilizing as if nothing had ever been wrong. The eerie black void outside was gone, replaced by a familiar, busy airport. And yet, Solomon knew the truth. The passengers who had vanished weren't coming back. The ones who remained would never remember what had happened. And as the plane taxied to the gate, Captain Lancaster slowly stood from his seat. He looked at Solomon, his face lined with exhaustion. "You got us down," he murmured. Solomon's hands curled into fists. But at what cost? Lancaster didn't answer. Because they both knew the flight would return. Maybe not tonight, maybe not for years. But one day, Flight 117 would fly again. And when it did, someone else would take the seat. The plane had landed. Flight 117 was finally home. Or at least that's what the world would believe. The passengers who remained, the few who had not vanished into the abyss, sat frozen in their seats. Some were staring at their hands, as if trying to remember if they had always been there. Others blinked in dazed confusion, looking around with vague, uncertain expressions, like people waking from a deep, dreamless sleep. No one screamed. No one spoke. Because none of them remembered. None of them knew that half the plane was gone. But Solomon Jacobs did. He sat in the cockpit, still gripping the edge of the captain's chair, his breath uneven, his body trembling as the weight of reality crushed down on him. It was over. And yet, it wasn't. Solomon knew the truth. Flight 117 would return. The cycle had been reset. Someone else had taken the seat. The shadow had chosen a new sacrifice. And now, Solomon had to live with that. The airport welcome. Outside, the airport was alive with activity. Ambulances, security teams, reporters. Flight 117 had been missing for hours. Long enough for panic to spread, long enough for people to assume the worst. But now, the plane had miraculously appeared on radar, making a perfect landing, as if it had never been lost at all. Solomon stepped into the jet bridge, blinking against the sudden glare of airport lights. Behind him, Captain Lancaster lingered in the cockpit, his face unreadable. Solomon turned to him, swallowing the bitter taste in his throat. "You're not coming out?" Lancaster smiled tiredly. "I think I'll stay a while longer," he murmured. "Make sure the next captain knows what to do." Solomon felt a cold weight settle in his gut, because now he understood. Lancaster wasn't going anywhere, not really. Not while Flight 117 still existed. Solomon gave him one last nod before stepping into the blinding light of the terminal. The media storm. The moment his feet touched the polished airport floor, a wave of chaos crashed over him. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in his face. Journalists shouted questions, their voices blending into a wall of noise. "Mr. Jacobs, can you tell us what happened? Was it a hijacking? A system failure? Why did Flight 117 disappear off radar for hours?" Solomon's pulse pounded. He could feel the lie forming on his tongue. Because what was he supposed to say? That the plane had been swallowed by something beyond human comprehension? That half the passengers had been erased from existence? Not by death, but by something far, far worse? No one would believe him. So he said nothing. Instead, he turned away from the cameras, heading straight for the private exit where his security team was waiting. But just as he reached the doors, a voice stopped him. "Mr. Jacobs." A familiar voice. Solomon froze, and when he turned around, his blood ran cold. The woman who shouldn't exist there, standing just beyond the crowd, was Karen. Karen Whitmore. The woman who had been sucked into the abyss. The woman who had vanished from existence. The woman who had died. She was here, standing right in front of him. And she was smiling. Solomon's stomach twisted violently. "That's not possible," he murmured. Karen cocked her head, watching him with amusement. "Why not?" she asked. "Did you really think I was gone?" Solomon stared. She looked normal. Her flight attendant uniform was untouched. Her skin was a glimpse of a plane flying forever, lost in a sky that didn't exist. And then, it was gone. Karen pulled away, looking amused. "You should go home, Solomon," she murmured. "Enjoy your freedom while you can." Solomon gritted his teeth. "And if I don't?" Karen's smile widened. "Then you'll be back on that plane before you know it." She took a step backward, and then she was gone. Vanished, like she had never been there at all. The final warning. Solomon stood there, his pulse hammering. His body was shaking. Flight 117 had landed, but the nightmare wasn't over. It had only changed, and whatever Karen had become, it wasn't done with him yet. As he turned toward the exit, one thought echoed in his mind. Flight 117 would fly again, and next time, he might not have a choice but to board. Solomon couldn't sleep. The hotel suite was silent, but his mind wasn't. He could still hear the engines, still feel the vibrations of the plane under his feet. And worst of all, he could still see Karen's face. Not the Karen from before. Not the arrogant flight attendant who saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience. But the thing she had become. Something not human. Something that had taken the shape of his enemy, just to taunt him. Solomon leaned forward, running a hand over his face. He knew what was coming. Flight 117 would fly again, and it wanted him back. The invitation. His phone buzzed. Solomon's stomach clenched. Slowly, he reached for the screen and froze. There was only one message from an unknown number. Your seat is waiting. A chill raced down his spine. His hands curled into fists. Number not this time. Solomon stood pacing the room. He needed to leave, disappear. If he got far enough away, maybe, just maybe, he could outrun this. But the moment he grabbed his suitcase, a voice spoke behind him. Going somewhere? Solomon whirled around, and there she was. Karen, standing in his hotel room, like she had walked straight out of the abyss. Her expression was calm, her posture elegant, composed, but her eyes? They weren't Karen's eyes, they were bottomless. Solomon felt a shudder deep in his bones. You're not real, he whispered. Karen's lips curled into a smirk. And yet, here I am. She took a step forward. Solomon backed away. You lost, he hissed. I landed that plane. It's over. Karen tilted her head. Is it? She gestured toward the window. Solomon turned, and his blood ran cold. Outside the hotel? The airport was gone. In its place, a runway stretched into darkness. A plane sat waiting, the number on its tail. Flight 117. Solomon's chest tightened. He spun back toward Karen, his voice raw. Number I won't go back. Karen's smile widened. You don't have a choice. And then, the walls of the hotel room collapsed. Back in the sky. Solomon's lungs burned. 1 second, he was standing in his hotel. The next, he was on the plane. First class. His seat. The same damn seat. He gasped, gripping the armrest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The final landing. Solomon gasped. He was standing at the airport, his suitcase in his hand. The flashing lights of the terminal blinded him. A flight attendant's voice rang out over the speakers. Now boarding, Flight 117. Solomon's entire body went cold. He turned, and there it was. The plane. Waiting. But this time, Karen wasn't there, and Solomon wasn't on board. The cycle had been broken. For now. Solomon exhaled, his hands trembling, and slowly he walked away, leaving Flight 117 forever. Or at least he hoped. Because deep down, he knew. Somewhere, in some sky, that plane was still flying, waiting for the next passenger, and someday, it might come back for him, but not today. Not today. Lessons in humanity. The power of respect, justice, and breaking the cycle of racism. At the heart of Solomon, Jacob's harrowing journey lies a truth that transcends horror, suspense, and supernatural forces. It is a reflection of human nature, of prejudice, power, and the fight for dignity in a world that often seeks to diminish it. His experience aboard Flight 117 is not just a story of survival. It is an allegory of the deeply entrenched racism that continues to exist in society, manifesting in both overt discrimination and the more insidious, everyday microaggressions that people of color face. Solomon's battle against an unrelenting force mirrors the struggles of many Black individuals who must constantly prove their worth, defend their right to exist in spaces where they are unwelcome, and challenge a system that is designed to keep them in place. But beyond the terror, his story is one of strength, resistance, and ultimately triumph over an unjust system that sought to consume him. A powerful testament to resilience and the necessity of breaking cycles of oppression. One of the most poignant themes in the narrative is the role of prejudice and superiority in fueling systemic injustices. Karen Whitmore, the flight attendant who saw herself as an enforcer of elitism, represents a mentality that has existed for centuries, a belief that black individuals are less deserving of privilege, access, and respect. Her contempt for Solomon, despite his status as a billionaire, highlights a painful reality. Racism does not disappear with success. A black man, regardless of his wealth or achievements, can still be demeaned, questioned, and dehumanized simply because of the color of his skin. Solomon's very presence in first class was an affront to Karen because, in her mind, first class was reserved for those who belonged, and Solomon, in her view, never would. This mirrors real-world encounters where black professionals are often second-guessed in boardrooms, assumed to be service workers instead of executives, and are made to feel like outsiders in spaces they have rightfully earned a place in. But racism, as depicted in the story, is not just about one cruel flight attendant. It is an entire system, a structure that perpetuates itself through complacency and silence. The other passengers who saw the mistreatment, yet chose not to intervene, reflect the bystander effect, a chillingly accurate portrayal of how racism thrives when good people refuse to act. In today's world, racism does not always come in the form of blatant hatred. It can exist in the quiet acceptance of discrimination, in the failure to speak up when witnessing injustice, and in the excuses made for those who engage in racist behavior. This forces us to ask ourselves an uncomfortable but necessary question. How often do we ignore wrongdoing simply because it does not affect us personally? What makes Solomon's story compelling is that he did not seek revenge. He sought justice. He did not allow rage to consume him, nor did he succumb to hatred. Instead, he fought smartly, outmaneuvering both Karen and the dark forces that tried to claim him. His decision to turn the system against its enforcers, to make Karen take the seat instead, was a metaphorical reversal of power. It was a moment where the oppressor became the oppressed, forced to experience the very suffering she had so gleefully inflicted. This teaches us that while anger is a natural response to injustice, true victory comes. There is beauty in human nature, even amidst horror. The elderly woman who tried to help, the passengers who eventually spoke out, and even the former bystanders who realized their mistake all symbolize hope. Proof that while racism is deeply embedded in society, change is possible. Empathy, when awakened, can transform people. This is a lesson for all of us. We must be willing to see, to acknowledge, and to act when injustice is present. Silence is complicity, and complicity allows evil to thrive. The final lesson, perhaps the most important, is that justice is not the end. It is only the beginning. Solomon may have escaped Flight 117, but he knew that the fight was not over. He understood that the world does not change overnight, and that his survival was not just about himself, it was about ensuring that no one else would suffer the same fate. This is a call to action. It is not enough to survive oppression, we must dismantle it. It is not enough to break free, we must ensure that no one else is trapped. Solomon's fight is the fight of every marginalized person who dares to exist in a world that tells them they shouldn't. It is the fight of those who refuse to be erased, who demand their seat at the table, and who will not be silenced, no matter how much the world wants them to be. In the end, Flight 117 is more than a haunted plane. It is a reflection of society, of the way racism, elitism, and oppression continue to recreate themselves in new forms. But as Solomon Jacobs proved, cycles can be broken. Those who suffer today do not have to suffer tomorrow. We, as a society, hold the power to rewrite the rules, to reject the forces that seek to keep us in place, and to finally land the plane for good.